What happens when a group of officers mocks a man they think is powerless, only to discover he's one of the most powerful civil rights lawyers in the country? A moment of ridicule turns into a life-changing lesson on respect, humility, and the true meaning of justice. It was a quiet afternoon when everything changed. The kind of day when time feels like it's standing still. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the sound of paper shuffling, it all seemed normal. But then, the door to the station opened and in walked a man. He didn't stand out at first. He was just a man, in his mid-30s, dressed in casual clothes, walking in like any other person. But there was something in the way he held himself, something in his eyes, that made you pause and look twice. He wasn't loud or demanding, but you could sense there was more to him than met the eye. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't speaking. He wasn't talking at all. His hands moved instead, signing in the air. It wasn't the kind of sign language I was familiar with, but it was clear he was trying to communicate something important. The officers at the desk noticed it too. There were a few awkward moments, some confused glances, but then, a few of the younger officers started laughing. They didn't understand. They saw him as different, and rather than trying to help, they mocked him. It wasn't loud at first, just a few chuckles here and there, but soon, their laughter grew. The young officer was fresh out of the academy, his face eager but green. It was clear he didn't understand the weight of his actions, but that didn't excuse what was about to happen. He had a smirk plastered on his face, like he thought he was being clever, and he couldn't resist showing off in front of his colleagues. Without missing a beat, he began imitating the man's hand gestures, mocking the way his fingers moved through the air as if trying to communicate something important. His voice was dripping with sarcasm as he called out, "What's he trying to say, huh?" The others hesitated for a moment, unsure how to react. But when they saw the officer's grin and the way he kept mimicking the man's hand movements, they began to join in. The tension in the room built as more officers laughed, some covering their mouths, others just watching with wide eyes. There was no empathy, no attempt to understand. It felt like a show, a cruel one, and they were all too eager to be a part of it. I stood there, frozen, my heart sinking. I could feel the weight of the moment, the ugliness of it. The mockery wasn't funny. It wasn't playful. It was cruel, and it was painful to watch. They were belittling him because they couldn't understand him, laughing at the way he moved his hands, at his disability, as if that somehow made him less than them, and I couldn't help but feel disgusted. This wasn't the kind of behavior I ever thought I would see in this station, especially from officers sworn to uphold justice. The man didn't react at first. His face remained neutral, as though he was trying to process what was happening, trying to make sense of it. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch or raise his voice. He just sat there, still, watching them with calm eyes. But if you looked closely, you could see the flicker of frustration. Small, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. It was the way his eyes darted between the officers, his shoulders tensing just slightly. He was holding it together, but it was clear that the laughter was starting to cut deep. The sound of the laughter kept growing, getting louder, sharper. It felt like the room itself was closing in, and I could feel the man's discomfort, the way he was holding back from reacting. But the officers didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in their own amusement. It was as if they thought his silence, his calmness, was permission to keep going. They thought because he couldn't speak up, because he couldn't retaliate the way they could, that they had the right to belittle him. They didn't realize that they were crossing a line, that they were turning what could have been a moment of understanding into a moment of humiliation. And then, just when it seemed like the laughter was about to drown everything else out, the man did something that completely took us all by surprise. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It was an ordinary business card, white with black text, but the significance of it hit like a punch to the gut. He handed it to the officer who had been mocking him the most, the one with the biggest grin on his face. The officer took it, still smiling, not knowing what to expect. But when he saw the name on the card, everything changed. His smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. The card trembled in his hand, and his face went pale as recognition hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any man. This was Michael H. Carter Esker, one of the most renowned civil rights attorneys in the country. The room went silent. The officer looked at the card, then back at the man, his mind racing to understand what he had just missed. The name was not one to be taken lightly. Michael H. Carter was a name that appeared on TV screens, in news stories, and in courtrooms where lives were on the line. This was a man who had spent his career fighting for the rights of the voiceless, advocating for justice in a way that few others could. The young officer's mouth hung open as he tried to process the mistake he had just made. His laughter had turned into embarrassment, and the others around him began to shift uncomfortably. No one knew how to react. The jokes that had once seemed harmless now felt like poison in the air. And the man, this lawyer, this giant of a person in his own right, was the one they had mocked. And suddenly the situation felt like 100 times more serious than any of them had anticipated. The man, still calm, said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to leave the officers speechless. All of them were now fully aware of the gravity of what had just happened. But Michael didn't look angry. He didn't even look disappointed. He simply looked at them, waiting for them to realize their mistake. The officers who had been laughing nervously avoided his gaze, their heads lowered, realizing just how far they had crossed the line. The young officer who had started it all was the most visibly shaken. He looked at the card, then at Michael, and then back at the card, as if the truth hadn't quite sunk in yet. In that moment, the world shifted. What had started as a cruel joke, something that could have been forgotten in an instant, now felt like a moment of reckoning. Michael didn't need to raise his voice or get angry. He didn't need to explain who he was. The card spoke for him. His identity, his reputation, his very being, spoke louder than anything any officer could say or do. The silence that followed was deafening. With a quiet, almost serene grace, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, white business card. The action was deliberate, measured, and completely unexpected. As he handed the card to the officer who had been mocking him the most, there was a brief moment of confusion in the officer's eyes. He looked at the card, his brow furrowing, unsure of what to make of it. The card appeared ordinary at first glance, but as he saw the logo of a prestigious law firm and the title Esker next to the name, the officer's expression began to shift. It was subtle at first, a slight twitch of his lips, a momentary flash of recognition. He looked back at Michael, then back at the card, but still, he couldn't quite place the name. The officer's fingers gripped the card tightly as he turned it over, his eyes scanning the details with growing unease. And then, it clicked. The realization hit him like a slap across the face. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and his hand trembled ever so slightly as the truth began to sink in. The name on the card was unmistakable: Michael H. Carter Esker. At that moment, the room seemed to fall into slow motion. The officer, still standing there with the card in his hand, stared at it as if the name itself were some kind of revelation he couldn't fully comprehend. Michael H. Carter wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the most renowned civil rights attorneys in the country. A man whose name was associated with some of the most groundbreaking legal battles of the last few decades. I knew that name well. It had been plastered across news headlines, broadcasted on TV stations, and mentioned in interviews countless times. Michael H. Carter had fought tirelessly for justice in cases that had reshaped the very laws of the land. He was known for his unwavering commitment to the voiceless, for his refusal to back down when faced with powerful adversaries, and for his ability to win cases that no one thought could be won. He had been a champion for the marginalized, the oppressed, and the overlooked. And here he was, standing in front of these officers, the same man they had just mocked moments before. The room went completely still. The officer holding the card now looked at Michael, his face paling, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to speak but had no words to offer. The others who had been laughing only seconds earlier now stood frozen, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock to embarrassment. It was as though the very air had thickened, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on all of us. Michael didn't need to say a word. He didn't flinch. didn't look at them with anger or contempt. He simply stood there, his posture straight, his face calm, his eyes unwavering. He didn't need to explain himself. The name on the card, the reputation behind it, did all the talking for him. The young officer who had been mocking him could barely meet his gaze. The laughter that had once filled the room now seemed to echo in his ears, a cruel reminder of how wrong he had been. His face flushed a deep shade of red, the embarrassment and shame clearly written across his features. The others around him shuffled nervously, avoiding each other's eyes, realizing just how far they had crossed the line. They had underestimated this man, had thought he was just another vulnerable person they could belittle. But they were wrong. They hadn't just mocked a man with a disability, they had mocked one of the most powerful voices for justice in the country. And now, they had to face the consequences. The silence in the room was deafening. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable, the weight of the situation hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The officer who had been laughing the loudest still stood frozen, holding the card in his hand, his eyes flicking between Michael and the card, as if trying to reconcile the image of the man he had mocked with the lawyer who had just been revealed. No one knew what to say, or even if words could make things right. The damage had already been done. The laughter, the mockery, the cruelty, it had all happened, and no apology could erase the sting of it. But as the awkward silence stretched on, it was clear that something had to give. Finally, the sergeant, a seasoned officer who had been quietly observing the situation from the sidelines, stepped forward. His voice was different now, no longer commanding or indifferent, but respectful and full of genuine regret. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone soft but sincere, "I apologize for the behavior of my officers. This will be addressed immediately." The words hung in the air, sincere, but also tinged with the realization that they could never fully undo what had been done. The sergeant's eyes were steady, his gaze not just on Michael, but on the other officers in the room, as if reminding them of their duty to uphold dignity and respect. Michael didn't respond right away. His face remained calm, composed, unaffected by the apology. He didn't need it. He didn't need any of them to apologize to him, not really. The apology was more for them than for him, and he knew that. He had already shown them what mattered most, who he was, and what he stood for. With a slight nod, Michael acknowledged the sergeant's words, his expression unchanged. There was no anger in him, no need for it. His calm demeanor spoke volumes. He didn't need to say anything because he had already said everything with his actions. The truth had been revealed, and that was enough. The officers who had laughed earlier now stood with their heads down, their eyes avoiding Michael's gaze. They couldn't undo the hurt they had caused, but they would carry the weight of it with them from that moment on. They had been given a lesson they would never forget, one that didn't need words or explanations. It was a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of silent strength. As Michael turned to leave, the room remained still. There was no applause, no cheers, just the quiet realization that in that moment, one man had taught an entire room a lesson in dignity and justice. As Michael left the station, the air felt different. It was as if we had all been changed in some way. The officers who had mocked him weren't laughing anymore. They were standing there, feeling the weight of their actions. They had been humbled, not by a fight, but by the simple truth that they had made a mistake. Michael's strength wasn't in how he fought back. It was in how he remained silent, how he didn't need to defend himself. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He had faced mockery and disrespect, but instead of lashing out, he had shown them who he truly was. A man who had worked tirelessly for justice. A man who had fought for people like them, even though they hadn't realized it yet. As he walked out the door, I knew that the officers would never forget this day. And I knew I wouldn't either. Michael H. Carter had taught us all a lesson, one that none of us would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content that's full of impactful moments and unexpected twists, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and let us know what you think. If this story moved you, share it with your friends and help spread the message. Your support means the world to us. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more incredible stories.